So you found the skeleton. How would you tell people that it's you personally? How would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Welcome back for more stupidity from Genesis Apologetics. Today they're going to misunderstand common ancestors, or maybe branching in homology? It's not clear from the title, and I haven't watched this bit. Either way, get something to drink, something soft like a Dapper On-Set pillow, link to the merch store in the description, and let's settle in and lose a few brain cells. No alcohol required.
Is it just me, or does the evolutionary tree seem more like an orchard?
I promise, it's just you. The same way you can look at organisms today and recognize them as related, you can look at larger groupings and also recognize them as related. Any cutoff point to this process is arbitrary until creationists can find objectively quantifiable ways to tell what should and shouldn't be related, and then confirm that.
Organizing animals. It's like Carl Linnaeus.
Who's that?
Yeah, he was the first guy to classify animals.
Oh, yeah, I remember him now. His motto was, God created, Linnaeus ordered.
Yeah, his work is the basis for the classification system we still use today. Yeah, later, Charles Darwin sketched a diagram to show how life started simple and then branched out to every creature on Earth.
Yup, that was his motto. And I think you somewhat mischaracterized that diagram. It's just supposed to illustrate common ancestry, which does not necessarily involve increasing complexity.
He said the different branches represent the different levels of classification. A tree of life, if you will.
A tree that objectively exists in the real world. And isn't it odd how little of Linnaeus' work has been overturned? At least in terms of the group or taxa he identified. Sure, some of it has changed, but virtually all of the taxa he identified are still recognized today as valid clades, with only minor modifications. Linnaeus was a good scientist. So good, he got in some trouble with the ecclesiastics of his day, and even decided not to put humans into the ape category, just to avoid further trouble. Although, he originally had both orangutans and chimpanzees in the genus Homo.
Oh, yeah. I keep seeing this over and over again in our textbooks.
Really?
Yeah. Here we go. Check out this one.
Are researchers still trying to figure out how it happened?
Yes and no. There are still some mysteries in the tree of life, especially in how certain closely related groups fit into the pattern relative to each other, and how certain fossil forms are related to each other and today's organisms. Overall, though, the picture is pretty clear. We're really not going to find out someday that dogs are more closely related to humans than they are to horses. At that level, there's really not much question left.
There are a lot more of these diagrams. I think they change as different researchers group them based on different features.
These charts show groups of organisms they believe share a common ancestor.
Yeah, the details of a cladogram can change as more data is included or various models are used to assess them. That's what you call science. You don't just stick to whatever somewhat incorrect conclusion you got first and then just don't change it to fit new data. I get really tired of creationists complaining that science changes. That's a good thing. Things that update to take advantage of new information are good things. Things that just stay wrong forever are bad things. Why would you want to be wrong just so you don't have to change your conclusions? That's a terrible way to live and a worse way to run a society.
Yeah, a group like that is called a clade, and these diagrams are called cladograms.
Well, all organisms have a common ancestor, but a chart that big would be too big to fit meaningfully on paper, and if we are only considering a smaller group of organisms than the whole of life, they'll likely share a more recent common ancestor than the last common ancestor of all life. For example, the image you showed was of Arctoidea, including two mustaloids, the lesser panda from family Ailuridae, and raccoons, or family Procyonidae, and two ursids, that is, bears. One the giant panda, and the other confusingly labeled bears, but looking like an American brown bear. As we can see, the mustaloids have a common ancestor, as do the ursids, and both of these common ancestors have their own Arctoidean common ancestor.
So, remember that modern evolutionary classification is a rapidly changing science with a difficult goal: to present all life on a single evolutionary tree. As evolutionary biologists study relationships among taxa, they regularly change not only the way organisms are grouped, but also sometimes the name of groups. Remember that cladograms are visual presentations of hypotheses about relationships and not hard and fast facts.
Whoa. You're saying our textbooks say that cladograms are based off hypotheses, not facts.
What is this? Actual information about cladistics? That's my job, you two. Start saying nonsense already.
Yeah, I'll show you why. Flip forward a page. That's because they only have living animals or fossils for certain places on the branches.
Hypothesis isn't a synonym for guess. A hypothesis is also a conclusion. After evidence is gathered and examined, the conclusion you reach is a hypothesis. This hypothesis can then be tested. The result of the testing is a new conclusion, which is a new hypothesis that better fits the available data. All a hypothesis is a possible and plausible idea for what may be the case given the current evidence. It is always based on evidence, and it is always a conclusion based on evidence. How badly can one pair of humans misunderstand science?
These are real animals or fossils we've actually discovered. But these branching points are just imaginary lines that represent the hypotheses about which animals evolved from a common ancestor.
I don't even understand what that's supposed to tell me about this idea that cladograms aren't based on evidence. Fossils and living organisms are evidence. Carolus Linnaeus made what was a cladogram in all but name without any fossils, and he got it pretty well correct in most places, all without genetics or fossils. And most of what has been discovered has confirmed his findings. It's just that that's not as interesting as the times it hasn't, so you tend to hear about the exceptions.
No facts support them that can't also support different links, or no link.
The reason we don't place known forms as the common ancestor is that in most cases there's no way to know for sure who that ancestor was. For example, let's say that your ancestry is from Japan, and so was that of your friend. As far as you know, you two aren't related, but as it turns out, you both take a DNA test, and, hey, what do you know? You're fourth cousins. Well, that's cool. You share at least one great-great-great-grandparent. You decide to investigate. So you get all 8 of your collective grandparents to also take a DNA test to see which of them are cousins. And you find out. Unfortunately, though, the ones who match have slightly conflicting stories about exactly what their names of their ancestors are. So you do some digging and find the town that they all came from. Let's just say it's Sasebo. Literally only because I've personally been there. Well, now you can see who was around in Sasebo at the time of your great-great-great-grandparents. Some of them are more or less related to you, and you find 10 candidates, all of whom were the right age and in the right place to be your ancestors. But which of them is it? You can't really find out, and since they were almost certainly cremated, you probably can't even test their DNA. At this point, you're stuck. You have some potential ancestors, but you can't tell which of them it is, and you can't even really be sure it's any of them. So, do you have evidence about your family and relationship to your friend that you didn't have before? Of course you do, even though you still can't identify an exact ancestor. Similarly, in organisms, things like character analysis and DNA analysis can determine relatedness, and we can find intermediate forms in the fossil record that match the description of a common ancestor, and that is around at about the right time. But we can't do a DNA sequence, so we don't know which, if any, of the forms we found is actually the ancestor of modern forms. But it still means we have gained useful knowledge about the ancestry of these organisms.
The transitional fossils they represent have never been found. If they were, well, we'd see their pictures here, right?
No.
Many facts support them. In fact, cladograms are based on pages of quantifiable data from either DNA, morphology, or both, and are constructed via a few different methods, and each method tends to yield a similar, although usually not identical, tree. There is no question that all mammals share a common ancestor with each other more recently than they do with birds. The evidence supporting any cladogram is voluminous. Try reading a paper in the phylogenetic systematics literature. The amount of data used is often staggering. So much so that the analysis of it must be machine-assisted. Ain't nobody got time for that.
Though evolutionists point to a few examples, there should be thousands.
First, transitional forms are all over the place. See? Some of them, like Archaeopteryx, Tiktaalik, Probainognathus, and Pakicetus, were predicted. But you know where they fall in a cladogram with their living relatives? At the tip of branches. Because, just like with your potential grandparents in Japan, we can't know for sure which, if any of them, are the actual ones at the nodes. But we know they're in the right ballpark.
Genesis 1:21 says, "So God created great sea creatures and every living thing that moves, with which the waters abounded, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good."
Really, we don't need any transitional fossils, or any fossils at all, in order to adequately confirm evolution. But how many transitional forms do you need and why to confirm that, say, rhinoceroses, or should that be rhinoceroi, and horses have a common ancestor? We have about a dozen fossil species, and the DNA of the living animals. Should we have more? How many? The fact is we don't need any. They're just nice to have. But it will never be enough for creationists. Every transitional form found is a confirmation of evolution. So, if you want us to take creationism seriously, start predicting some fossils that evolution would say shouldn't exist. Then go find them. Do that, and I'll start taking you seriously when you complain about how the numerous transitional fossils we have don't actually count because you keep shifting the goalpost.
From the beginning, God created fully formed kinds of animals.
Okay, but Genesis isn't evidence in science. Hard data is evidence in science. If Genesis informs your ideas about what may have happened, that's fine, but you're going to have to back it up with actual findings from the real world. In order to know if your interpretation of the Bible is reasonable, it has to be subjected to both the tests of the rest of the Bible and reality. If it's not compatible with both, then either the Bible is wrong or your interpretation is wrong. Either way, you're wrong in such a case. So reality always has to test your idea about what's true based on the Bible, or you'll never know if you're right. Sure, I can't force you to do this, but if you don't, you'll only ever be right by accident.
So, it isn't a tree like Darwin thought. Instead, it's an orchard.
Then demonstrate that. Show which organisms are from a kind, how we know, why they can't be related, then publish that and see if other people get the same results or if they can shoot you down. I have my own suspicions about what would happen if you did that, but you won't, so it doesn't matter.
God created the different kinds of animals, and then they expressed all types of amazing variety as they bred within their kind.
And recombining genetic possibilities that God packed into the original kinds produced that variety?
But even in your orchard, you're drawing cladograms. You have no way to put anything at those nodes either, so how do you know your trees are valid? How do you know if someone connecting two of them together is wrong? You don't, and you can't. Any point where you cut off a cladogram and declare that the ancestors beyond that are fake, and that the cladistics after that are valid, is arbitrary. Why are apes all related to each other, but not other old-world monkeys? Why are the ceratopsians related to each other, but not to pachycephalosaurs? No reason. You just thought that it seemed like a place that your ill-informed audience wouldn't object to.
Exactly. We see variation happening all the time, but we've never seen the evolutionary process of mutations and selection creating new kinds.
Hey, that's something I covered in the last episode about natural selection and mutations. Check out episode 7 of Genesis Apologetics Should Apologize. It's fully badly animated.
So dogs, apes, and people can show variety, but can never morph into a new kind.
Well, we've seen them create new species, and since you've never bothered to give us a way to tell if a kind has been created, I guess you didn't actually say anything with that statement.
Yep, just like the orchard. One basic tree kind can never become another. Scientists seem to name something a new species, even if there's only a minor change.
Well, humans are apes. In fact, they're not even a sister group to the other apes. They're grouped with the chimpanzees and bonobos, and then all 3 of those species group with the gorillas before they do with the orangutans. Then all 6 of the great apes group together with each other before they do with the lesser apes. Already, you failed at identifying a kind. But further, are you imagining that some animals will cross from, say, ape to dog? Because that's just not how evolution works. Organisms can speciate, leading to the founding of new clades, but they can't climb back up the family tree to go down a different branch and join a clade that they were never part of. Dogs can't become apes, they will always be dogs. Even if they diversify into flying forms or aquatic forms or animals that only eat grass, they'll still be dogs, although you might not know it at first glance.
And in the fossils, the smallest variation is classified as a different species, even though we see lots of variety with some species today.
Look, where to draw the line between species isn't easy. It's almost like speciation is usually a gradual process where you can't draw a hard line and say, now there are 2 species. But it also clearly happens. In fact, even creationists accept that it happens, which of course means that they accept macroevolution.
Like what?
Like in dogs. Just think about all the variety in the breeds of dog kinds, Canis familiaris, in the last 200 years.
I actually agree that paleontologists are too quick to name a new species. I get it that since there's no way to prove that the variation isn't a new species, and that it's cool to be able to name a new species, that this is probably a problem that's not going anywhere anytime soon. But yeah, paleontologists probably have named more species than is warranted, and we know for a fact that they've sometimes called growth stages new species.
If future paleontologists dug up the bones of a bulldog, a chihuahua, and a Great Dane, they would surely classify them as 3 different species. But they are all the same kind.
Okay, hold up. Picking dogs isn't quite fair either. Dogs have an outrageous and artificial degree of physical variation. If you want a more reasonable comparison, try looking at the natural variation in the gray wolf excluding dogs, that is Canis lupus, or in Panthera tigris, the tiger. These are species with a wide but not exaggerated diversity in morphology. And yes, if we found their fossils, it's likely that the Arctic wolf and the Asiatic wolf would be classed as different species, and that the Sumatran tiger and the Bengal tiger would be classified as different species. First, I could make a decent argument that they actually are different species, since they couldn't interbreed without artificial help, and so their gene pools would be isolated by nature. Although for the bulldog, they just can't breed at all without human aid, and so they're less of a species and more of an abomination spawned from the darkest places of the human soul, whose mere existence should bring mortals to the precipice of madness and despair. Anyway, second, so is kind now down to a subspecies? Because those are all Canis lupus domesticus, even though you stupidly think that Canis domesticus is still a valid taxon. Because if a kind is a subspecies, then I hate to break it to you, but you can create a new kind of vertebrate in your lifetime with some careful breeding.
Whether beaks of a finch change shape or a color of a moth, the changes are limited.
Limited by what? What prevents a moth from changing the color and shape of its wings, the shape of its eyes, the shape of its antennae, and the silk produced during the shift from larva to pupa stage? Nothing that I know of. Yet these are the differences between butterflies and moths, animals most creationists don't think are in the same kind. Similarly, what prevents an amphicyanid from walking more on its toes and becoming a dog? Or what prevents it from getting bigger and a shorter tail and becoming a bear? See, that's the thing. These differences are all things that are entirely reasonable. There's no hard barrier between kinds, and when you get to the more basal members of various groups in the fossil record, it shows that the difference between various groups of organisms is far more slight and superficial than the average creationist is comfortable with. For example, you might think that the differences between horses and rhinos are vast, but in the earliest fossils of both groups, the only real difference is in the shape of the molars. Evolution always proceeds by adding superficial divergence over top deeper homology.
When it's just expressing variety within the created kind.
Yup, so evolutionists consider adjustments to existing traits evidence that evolution made those traits in the first place.
All evolution is adjustments to existing traits. That's sufficient to explain the whole of biodiversity. It really is. You might think that the transition from what's basically a sponge to a human involves a lot of new stuff, and in some ways that's true, but in a fundamental way, every step involved only modifying what came before it to make it a bit different. And all along that way, other organisms were making different minor changes and branching off and growing increasingly different from their cousins.
So, what if God made each basic kind with potential to change some of its traits, but no potential to morph into a different kind? Dogs can breed with coyotes, and coyotes can breed with wolves. They called a coywolf, so they must all be part of the same created kind. So they have a common ancestor, but it was the original dog kind that God created.
But not all dogs can breed with each other, unless by dog you mean only the Canis genus, in which case kind goes all the way down to genus. But the thing is that reproductive isolation has been observed happening in actual organisms. In the case of polyploidy, it can happen in as little as a single generation. So we know that reproductive compatibility can't be the diagnostic by which we judge whether there's a common ancestor, because we know for certain of organisms that can't breed but had a common ancestor. And we know because we were there.
Not the transition between a reptile and a mammal like they show in these textbooks.
Ugh. Stay tuned because I'm going to cover the reptile-mammal transition later, probably as an episode of Things That Aren't Dinosaurs. Suffice it to say that since they haven't ever defined kind, and all the changes between primitive amniotes and modern mammals are just modification of what's already there, like they said that they accepted, there's no reason that this poses a problem, even based on their own definitions.
So fossils, the classification of animals, and the Bible are all in harmony.
That's what it looks like.
I mean, sure, as long as you change your interpretation of the Bible. I don't really think that the Bible has as one of its goals the systematic classification of living organisms. Alright, that's their last argument, and they don't even bother preaching, just continuing their little skit, which I've cut out. That's it for now. Remember to like, subscribe, and share this video. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Thanks for watching. Before you go, I'd like to take a minute to thank my patrons, especially my $20 patrons, Ben Tovand, Bob Knob, The Evil Scotsman, Henry Hutanen, Chris Love, and Res Instance. If you'd like to help me make videos like this, why don't you head over to my Patreon. I have tiers starting as low as $1 and going all the way up to $100. You'll get access to my Discord, as well as some other exclusive items that only my patrons get to see. You'll also occasionally get early access to my videos. If a monthly subscription isn't right for you, but you'd still like to help out, you can check out my merch store or my Amazon.com wishlist, both of which are linked in the description. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur.
So you found the skeleton. How would you tell people that this happens? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.